Have you ever looked back on an experience, whether it was maybe camp, a certain trip that you went on, or maybe just life in general, and you're like, I can't believe that flew by so fast? And I think the older we get, the faster it starts to move. And what we need to try to figure out is how is it that we can start to really acknowledge and see what's going on. So when the time does come, when the things do happen in our own personal lives, we'll be able to just be living with more intention. Because so many of us go through our days and we're just in this routine and we're just going through the same motion over and over and over again. And because we're doing that, what really ends up happening is we end up just floating through life. We're like on this lazy river of life, and we don't get off until we die. And the difference between the people who are gaining from life, who are taking from life, versus the people who might just be going through it, are the ones who are going to be more intentional about what it is they're doing. And the reason why I was thinking about this is because I've been recently trying to eat a little healthier, and I really don't know anything about health. And I said to myself, if I really want to be focusing on my health, I need to be more intentional about it. I just can't assume like I'm eating healthy or eating better than I was. Even like what I'm eating now is still not healthy. It's just like healthier than like what I've been eating. Or maybe I need to be working out more. And like, yes, those make sense. And those are like the big ideas, but like, am I being as intentional about it? Do I really know what I should be eating? Do I know how much protein I should be eating? Do I know how many calories I should be eating? And this is just one specific area of my life. But I realized, hey, you know what? If I can get more intentional in this area of my life, or maybe in other areas of my life, it will start to overflow. And I think what happens so many times is that people don't realize that we need to start to be more intentional, because the more intentional we can start to be, the more we're going to be taking from it, the more we'll be able to do. And the older we get, the faster it gets. And we need to try to figure out how is it that we can slow things down? How is it that we can start to understand what it is we're doing, be there when we're trying to live it, and make sure that we're doing the things that we want. And I think so many times people don't realize, but I really believe that one of the big ideas of fulfillment, and this is what I talk about in my class that I offer, one of the big things about fulfillment is that we need to be present. If we are not being present, we're not going to be feeling fulfilled. We might be doing meaningful work, but we're not going to have that fulfillment. We're not going to be feeling good about what it is that we're doing. We'll give you a couple examples today. We're going to talk about some issues that come up when it comes to this idea of intentionality. We're going to talk about some misconceptions that we might have about it, and then also give you some practical tools that you can start to use to make sure that we can move forward. But everybody has to understand that at the end of the day, we need to be present, because we want to be able to focus on the future. We want to be able to learn from the past, and we want to be able to be living here right now. And for some reason, everybody is so either focused on the future that they're putting themselves like, I can't wait to get to X, Y, and Z. And they're sort of just ignoring their time now, or they're trying to just get through this time now. Or they might be living in their past and saying, hey, that thing happened to me, or maybe good or bad, but that's who I am. And if we have that, either one of those perspectives, we are not going to be living for the moment, and the moment is just going to fleet. It's just going to go by. So what is it that we can start to do? And a couple of issues that really come up when it comes to intentionality is, number one, is that a lot of people do the same work over and over again. And they talk about how success is really boring, how when we go through things in our own personal life, we want to become successful at it, and we learn the shtick in order how to do it, that shtick is going to be extremely boring, because we're just doing the same repetitive steps. So how is it that possible that we could start to be more intentional about those steps, even if it's the same thing that we that we need to be doing? The second thing we need to know and really understand is that we don't know what being intentional really means. Meaning, if I want to be more intentional about my health, I could start thinking about my health. But if I'm not learning about my health, if I'm not really preparing myself, if I want to be more intentional about my business or my relationships, but I'm not constantly working on them, it's very nice that I can be present in the relationships. But if I'm not constantly working on it, then that's going to be the thing I'm not going to be able to constantly change. And I'm not going to get better at it. I'm not going to be able to focus on it and really become more in that area. And I think so many times people don't really necessarily realize this, but I think there is something to say on the one hand that you need to put in the reps and you need to put in the time, and something that there are certain times in my life, and I'll like even when I'm building my YouTube channel, that's like one of the things that I'm focusing on. Like, let me just do the reps, because I know if I could get myself committed to 50 episodes, that's a 50 videos that I want to put out, then all of a sudden I know there's some intentionality there, that I have some data, that I could go back and I can start to look at it. But to me, to start nitpicking on every little thing that I'm doing, what ends up happening is I'm going to get burnt out. I'm not going to end up taking that action. And it's one of those things that when somebody's looking to write a book, when I was writing my book, what the biggest advice I got was finish the book and then go back to edit it. You don't want to be editing while you're constantly writing it, because what happens is that you get so burnt out from the editing process, and it's never going to be perfect, that you end up never finishing the book. And how many people have started a book, they started editing it, and then all of a sudden they only have a chapter or 2 or 3. So we ourselves have to know for ourselves, if we're trying to become somebody for something, if we're trying to step ourselves up into a certain place, we have to know that we can't be guessing, and we have to look to iterate, but look to iterate at the right time. We have to put in the motion, but also recognize that we have to be focusing on getting the work done, and then looking to iterate and knowing where we are in that piece. And then the third thing, and I think the hardest part about this, is like, how can we remind ourselves? So many people like know that they want to be more intentional, they want to be more present with their lives, but they don't know how to remind themselves. They don't know how to get themselves into that moment where they're like, okay, this is what I need to be doing. This is what I need to be focusing on. How's it I could do it? And I think if we could start to ask those questions, and feel free to put in the chat any other questions that you might have, but any other questions, if we could start focusing on those questions that we have on intentionality. Number one is, how do we do it when we have the same work that we're doing over and over again? How do we be more intentional if we don't really know what intentional really means? The third thing is, how can we remind ourselves to become intentional? Because we want to be more intentional, but what is that we can start to do? And I think this leads to the misconceptions, because I think there's two big misconceptions. I'm sure there's more, but 2 big misconceptions that really people have. See, people think they need to be focused, or they need to be present 100% of the time. And they need to be focused, like, I need to be focused all day on what it is that I'm doing. And I think what we have to realize is that instead of trying to say, let me be focused 100% of the time, how can I check in with myself throughout the day? And in the beginning, maybe it's once a day, maybe twice a day. And even at the end, maybe it's 3 or 4 times a day. But I think so many people don't realize that if you could just check in with yourself throughout the day, then that's going to be the thing that's going to help you become more present and more focused over the long run. And I think the first time I got that piece of advice was on my wedding day. You see, as I was getting, heading to the wedding call, I was listening to a mentor, a friend of mine, and I remember them telling me, like, Bennett, today's gonna fly by. I actually had an afternoon wedding, and it was like, it's gonna fly by, and at the end of the day, it's gonna be exhausted, and it's gonna be like one huge blur. And he said, what I really suggest for you is not to be necessarily present the whole wedding, but at certain points throughout the wedding, just pause, just take it in. Could you just be there and just focus on, like, what's going on? And I took that advice, and I did it, and it was incredible, because there were certain times where I was just, whether I was dancing with friends, I was sitting at the table, I just sat there, and I was just like, oh wow, this is like amazing. Like, this is really awesome. Just noticing the people, noticing the sound, the music, the food that was there, the happiness and the joy that was in the room. And I think if we can start to understand that sometimes it's not about being intentional 100% of the time, but it's times throughout the process, we end up slowing things down, and we can start to really get ourselves into the place that we want. The next misconception I think that people have is that people think that they need to be, they need to be extremely intentional all the time, and they're going to, jump. And I think this is just with anything new that when people start, is that they want to do everything, at maximum capacity. So somebody wants to start working out, they're going to work out 5 times a week. And we have to understand that if we want to start becoming more intentional, we have to take it slowly. And I think this is one of those things that happened to me when I started to do my gratitude in my journal, really just started to show my appreciation for things. That I noticed that if I wanted to show my appreciation for certain things, if I really wanted to recognize them, then I have to start writing them down. And like 3 times a day, every day, I would write 3 things that I'm appreciative for. Try to not to do the same thing more than once, but just really starting to notice it. And what happened is that there was a time where my refrigerator in my house was broken. We moved into our new house. We got a refrigerator. It was from China, and it was a special new type of fridge in terms of the cooling system. And what was interesting is that when it broke, which was terrible, nobody knew how to fix it, because it was like this new type of fridge. And it was annoying because you call the people to come, they would come, and they're like, oh, you need to call somebody else because I don't know what I'm doing. And then they call somebody else, and take 2 months, and then another 2 months, and another 2 months. And finally, after our last time, pretty much they were like, let's just replace it. It'll be a lot easier. And it was, I think, 7 or 8 months. I just didn't have a fridge. We were living out in a mini fridge. It was awesome, great times for us. Not really, it was terrible times. But one of the things that I noticed after the fact is that when our fridge started working, when we got a new fridge, what I noticed is I really wrote down in my journal, like, I really appreciate my fridge. And a week or two after that, I was walking in my kitchen and I noticed my stove. And my stove was totally working, totally fine. And I just paused and I'm like, I really appreciate that my stove is working. I wasn't even using it, but I really appreciate that. And it was something that I think hit me pretty big, because I think on the one hand, we want to be more intentional and we want to be able to focus on it. But on the other hand, it was like, oh my gosh, like, because I started appreciating my fridge, I also now appreciate other things that I have. And I think if we could start to notice that, if we could start to focus on, hey, what's one small thing that I can start to do? When is one time in my life that I could be more intentional? Maybe it's when I wake up. Maybe it's when first time I see my kids. Maybe it's when I go to sleep and I'm with my spouse. Maybe it's, I get into my office and the first thing I'm doing to be more intentional. But what is one time that we could be intentional? That could be something that could be really beneficial for us. And we don't have to necessarily be fully intentional all the time, but when we're just getting started, we really want to start to build those muscles. So what are some practical tools that we can start to use? So on the one hand, number one, Brendan Bouchard talks about this idea where you want to, whenever he talks about it, how like whenever you want to step into a new room, you want to be intentional about it. And you want to pause like a second or two before you get into the room and really ask yourself two questions. Who do I need to be right now? And who does the person that I'm speaking to need me to be right now? And if we can start to ask ourselves those questions and we just pause and take that moment, pause, what ends up happening is we allow ourselves and we could train ourselves. Hey, every time I walk into a room, let me pause and let me acknowledge what I'm about to do and then go do the thing. And you don't need to be acknowledging it throughout the time you're doing it. But if you could just, before you do it, give yourself that 2-second pause, that could be something that could be extremely helpful. So pick one thing that you want to be doing in order to make yourself more intentional about what it is that you want to be doing. Number two is a really cool thing that you can do in order to just slow things down also is if you can reflect on what happened, because so many times we keep moving and the cycle keeps going forward and forward and forward. And what ends up happening is that we go through a whole vacation and there's like a million things that we did. And then all of a sudden we just like, what just happened? Like, how did that thing go by so fast? I just got back from Israel from a 2.5 week trip. And one thing that I did with my family is we went through like every day at the end of the trip, like, what did we do every day? And we kind of like think about it and remind ourselves what we did. And when you go back and you start reflecting, like, oh my gosh, we did so much, as opposed to saying, oh, we went on a 2.5 week trip and all of a sudden we did X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, we did more than that. We did so much. And if you could start to reflect on it and write it down, that could be something that could be really beneficial just for yourself, because then also the next time you go on a trip, you're going to be thinking about what it is that you did subconsciously, so you'll know what it is that you could write down afterwards. So I think that could be something that could be really, really beneficial. I think another thing that you could do is if you could take a deep breath, and I've heard this before in many different ways, but one of the ways that I like to think about it is like, if you are to want to be more present and you're like, how do I become more present? So we could really be only focusing on one thing at a time. And if we could just be in wherever it is that we are, and we could just be present and we could just deeply focus in one specific area and take that breath. Some people like to put their hand on their chest to like feel their heartbeat, but just acknowledge that breath. Like, just think about the breath coming in and coming out. What ends up happening is we end up centering ourselves, because we can only be focusing on one thing. And our breath is the one thing that we're going to be focusing on. And if we could start to do that, that could really get us back to the place that we want to be getting to. I think in regards to the one of the issues of not knowing how to be intentional, and this is going back to me and my health piece that I was talking about earlier, like, let's just learn about it. Let's just figure out what it is we need to do. Jim Rohn talks about how his mentor used to tell him that there's about half a dozen things, about 6 things that you need to learn in every specific category in order to become successful in that category, 80% successful in that category. So what are the 6 things that you need to be learning about? So figure out what's going on there. Nowadays, you could Google, you could learn, you could listen to podcasts, read books on all different topics. Try to figure out what's going on and then allow yourself to learn in those specific areas. Because I think if you do that, then all of a sudden things get a little bit different. And then the last thing I really think is like, just start small. If you could start small, that could be one of the things that could really start to change everything. That so many people don't realize that they want to become more intentional. They want to become more present in the moment. But if we could just start small, that could be something that could shift everything. And I think if we could start to become more intentional, I think that the quality of our lives are going to be different, because we end up not rushing through things. We don't want to just get through something, but we end up getting from something, and we get through an experience. And so many times as a kids, we want to be rushing through. We want to get out of school. We want to, we just want to be done with X, Y, and Z. And then we get to the next stage, and then we can't wait to get out of that stage. And then there's like another stage and another stage. And it's really training ourselves. Hey, you know what's going on here? And, for extra credit, if you could train your kids, that would be even better, to have them become more present and more focused on what's going on, more intentional. And I remember there was this story, I told the story before, about one time my kid came running over to me. It was in the morning. I came back from synagogue in the morning, and he came over to me. I think it was like around 7:30, 7:40. He's like, Daddy, you're not going to believe it. You're not going to believe it. I'm like, you just woke up. What did I miss? He goes, the sunrise. You missed the sunrise. It was so beautiful. I can't believe you missed it. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I go upstairs, and he showed me his window where he saw the sunrise. He's like, it was right there. You missed it. It's behind that house. And I go to my wife. I'm like, what's going on? Like, she's like half asleep. And she goes, he woke me up to tell me about the sunrise. And I ran over to go see it with him. And I was like, what's so interesting? What 5-year-old is looking at a sunrise? That sounds a little strange, if you ask me. And, later that day, I was like trying to think about it. I was like having a coffee, and I was like, what is going on there? Like, why is it that my 5-year-old is literally looking at a sunrise? Like, why does he know that's something that, like, we should start to appreciate? Yeah, it's beautiful, it's nice, but, like, why is he so excited about it? And I realized it because whenever there's whenever the sun goes down, my wife always shows him, like, hey, look at the sunset. It's amazing. It's beautiful. And start training him in terms of what it is he could do. And I noticed even when we go on walks and, like, he's noticing certain flowers, he does that because my wife is constantly showing it, being intentional, being purposeful, being in the moment. And I think if we can start to do something like that, if we could start to say, hey, you know what, how can I be more intentional in the moment? How can I be doing more? That could be the thing that could start to switch it. And so many times we don't realize it, but the people around us are being affected by us. And if we could do it, maybe not for ourselves, even though we'll benefit a great amount out of it, but if we could be more intentional about it for other people, that could be a thing that could start to change it. So let me know in the comments down below what you thought about these different ideas about being more intentional. Do you think being intentional is really that important, or just something nice? I'm a huge proponent that if you want to be living that fulfilling life, that we have to be more intentional. We have to know what's going on. We have to say, how can I be more intentional? And just going back quickly over the practical stuff. Number one is look to pause for like 2 seconds before you're about to do something. Maybe a specific, every time you go into your office, you come into your house, whatever it is you're doing, look to just pause. Number 2 is reflect on what happened, to slow things down, to really understand and really get a good glimpse of what happened. Number 3 is take a deep breath and focus on the breath itself. And if you can focus on the breath itself, that can really just center us. Number 4 is educate yourself in different areas to get more intentional. So it's not just you're going through the ropes, but it's really being more focused on what it is you're doing. And number 5 is start with something small and extra credit if you can start to teach that to somebody else. So let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to reach out, and I'll see everybody on the next one.